started. I want to welcome all of you to our first Hawkeye Lunch and Learn of this semester. And we're very happy to have with us today a friend of mine, but also an associate professor in political science here at the University of Iowa, Kerry Covington. His primary teaching and research interests are in the American presidency, and he focuses on governing relationships with Congress and the process by which candidates are nominated and elected to office. He's co-authored books on this topic and also several articles. His first caucus was in 1984, I believe, and since then he has worked with students, helping them to analyze and participate in the caucuses. And he's taken students to the 2000 Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, and in 2008 to the Democratic National Convention. And I believe that he's hoping to take students to the 2016 Republican Convention in Cleveland. He has taught classes on the Iowa caucuses and the presidential nominating process, and he has taught a course called Observing the Caucuses, and that is very important in terms of giving firsthand conversations about what actually happens in terms of the caucuses. He is frequently, and you may have seen him on local television, Iowa television, and also nationally, talking about the caucuses and the election process in general. And today he's going to discuss the evolution of the Iowa caucuses, identifying important trends and key events that have shaped the 2016 caucuses. So it's my honor today to welcome Kerry Covington.
Thank you, Linda. I was really honored to be invited to talk to you all about the caucuses. We've reached a point now in time where the spotlight has shifted away from us for a little while. It's on to other states. We can't take too much comfort, though, in that, because Iowa is also one of the relatively few battleground states in terms of the Electoral College. So once the parties have their nominees in place, we can expect a deluge of candidates and advertising to start up again in July and August. But right now, we're in a little bit of a interregnum, a little bit of a period of rest, and it's a good opportunity to reflect back on what's happened in 2016 and what can we learn from it going forward. And so I want to organize what I'm going to be talking about today around two features. First, I want to talk about what happened in the 2016 caucuses that are continuations of and knit us into how the caucuses have happened in the past. In other words, where are the continuities going forward? And then I want to talk about what happened in 2016, and indeed what's happening in 2016 that is kind of a disjuncture, a change from past trends, and maybe talk about a little speculatively about whether we're undertaking a new kind of trend that hasn't been true in the past. So let's begin by talking about Here we go. Let's begin by talking about what we learned from 2016 that sort of affirms what we thought we already knew, some of the conventional wisdom that we came out of the Iowa caucuses with. The first point I think we need to realize is, just as we've been saying since the 1970s, it's how you organize on the ground. It's how you prepare the ground game. Contact, organizing at the county level, enlisting volunteers, enlisting structure, and so on, that was critical. If we look at what happened, particularly on the Republican side, I've got organization trumps celebrity. And by that I mean that Ted Cruz, when he secured the endorsement of Bob Vander Plaats, who's the leader of Family Leader, a conservative evangelical organization, he received a huge benefit in terms of caucusing, because the evangelical movement not only cares about social issues, but they've been involved for many election cycles. They're well organized, they know each other, they have phone lists, they have people who participate, and you can be quite sure that if you get the support of these kinds of groups, those folks are going to turn out on caucus night. In contrast, we had Donald Trump relying on celebrity, large events, and so on, but didn't really have the ground game, didn't really have the organizational foundation that we always say is important, and that proved itself out to be important in the poll, in the caucus results. So I just want to look at here for a moment what we learned at the caucuses. And here we see the difference between the polls as they appeared the day of the caucuses and then the caucus result. And so you see Trump with over 28% support, but he fell short by over 4%. Ted Cruz, in contrast, had about 24%, and he overperformed by about 3.5%. And Marco Rubio, with a little under 17, got up to 23%, and so he overperformed by the 6.2%. And so, of course, when we look at who wins and who loses, we pay attention to the question of expectations. How do we think they're going to do? And so Marco Rubio, even though he comes in third, is oftentimes seen as the winner of the Iowa caucuses. But in this case, Trump lost because he didn't have the organization. Caucuses are, as you all know, caucuses are particularly labor intensive. And it's one thing to have somebody say on a phone call, oh yeah, I'm in favor of so-and-so. It's another thing to get those people out on a cold night and come and spend an hour or two with other folks to express their opinion. And so the general consensus is that while that support might have been in Iowa, it didn't necessarily turn out for Trump, whereas Cruz got exactly what he expected. And in fact, the interesting thing to me is that while Cruz's number was 24 on February 1st, you go back a week just to January 26th, his number was actually 27.5%. And so there was some stability for Cruz. He got that conservative evangelical vote pretty much like folks expected. And that's why Rubio is seen as the winner, because just in that last week, you had people making decisions at the last moment. The poll numbers were really moving for him, and so he overperformed. So the first result is clearly that being organized is important. Having the ground game is crucial to being successful, and that was reinforced. The second thing we learned from the Iowa caucuses, which we all know ahead of time, which is Iowa isn't in the business of choosing winners. There's usually too many candidates for us to go in and identify a winner, but what we do is identify who's not going to win, and we call that winnowing. We winnow out weak candidates. And so we saw with just hours or even days after the caucuses, 1 of 3 Democrats dropped out, 3 of the Republicans dropped out, because the Iowa caucuses revealed that their support wasn't there. They said, don't pay attention to the polls, we'll be better than people think, we have enthusiasm, and so on and so forth. But when push comes to shove and you have to have your support show up, there wasn't that support for these people. Once you don't do well, you start to get less media attention, people stop giving you money for campaign finance purposes, and you go into this kind of self-reinforcing cycle of that pushes you out of the campaign. And so those 4 candidates were gone. On the other hand, another thing we know is that if you do well in Iowa, it has positive repercussions. Your support is likely to go up. And we call that a bandwagon effect. And so if we look at what happened in the week following the Iowa caucuses, and it's important to point out that these poll numbers are before the Republican debate on Saturday, when Marco Rubio had his robotic moment of repeating himself 4 times. Before that happened, you can see what you might expect in terms of rewarding winners happening. Trump, who lost, sees his support go down. That was what you would expect. Cruz and Rubio are seen as winners. Their support goes up. Cruz's victory is not unexpected. It's not exciting. It's sort of what everybody anticipated. So he doesn't see as much of a bump, whereas Rubio, prior to the debate, does. Kasich and Bush are sort of bouncing around. They weren't a factor in Iowa, and so their numbers don't change that much. On the Democratic side, I put Clinton a win in quotes because of the close nature of the election and the contesting of that outcome that the Sanders people undertook. We see that while nationally her support goes down a little bit, in New Hampshire she actually receives quite a boost. Sanders, who loses, ties, sees his support go down. So the kind of an effect that we expect, which is a bump coming out of the caucuses depending on your performance, is validated. It happens. So Iowa doesn't choose winners, but it gets rid of weak candidates. It gives a bump to candidates who do well. The last thing that people have been talking about the caucuses and the nominating process in general is the rise of what we call independent expenditure groups. And that is a cluster of organizations. Most commonly we talk about super PACs. Super PACs are groups that can collect money and spend it all on the campaign. They can endorse candidates, but whoever gives money to a super PAC has to have their name identified to the Federal Election Commission, and so you can figure out who's putting money into super PACs. There are other kinds of independent expenditure groups, but mostly we're talking about super PACs. And so what we see in 2016 is an interesting bifurcation or division between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to independent expenditure groups. And the division happens before the 2012 election. So what happens between 2008 and 2012? If you follow politics, you might recognize the idea of Citizens United. Citizens United, a Supreme Court case handed down in 2010, says people can organize together and put as much money into an election PAC, super PAC as they like. And as long as they don't coordinate with the candidate or give money to a candidate, they can spend it however they wish. And so Citizens United, combined with another court case that didn't receive as much attention but was very important, it's called SpeechNow.org versus the FEC. Those two stimulated a lot of enthusiasm for maxing out your small contribution to a candidate, but then getting together with others and putting together massive amounts of money to support your candidate. So if you look at 2008, which is before the Citizens United case, you see Democrats and Republicans are having outside spending that's roughly comparable. The amounts compared to the amounts that the candidates are spending are a fraction of the total. Obama's spending $600 million. The Republicans are spending not that much, but still it's less than half. But the parties relatively evenly distributed super PAC support. About half of the money goes to Republicans and a little less than half goes to the Democrats. But after 2010, you see a clear shift in the pattern of giving. Republicans are tapping into the super PAC money much more deeply than are the Democratic candidates. So in 2012, you see about $140 million for the Democrats, but over $500 million for the Republicans. So the Republicans are getting over 3/4 of the independent money being spent on the campaign. Thus far, and this is through June of 2015 because of reporting requirements, you have Democrats, and this is almost all Hillary Clinton, getting a little over 17 million, whereas the Republicans are getting almost 250 million. So the Republicans are getting over 90% of the money that is being spent on super PACs. And this statistic is particularly telling. So if we look just at 2016, and we say, well, how much money do the candidates have in their own campaigns, and how much money is there in the independent expenditure category, we see that the establishment Republicans, which would include Bush and Kasich and Rubio and all those sort of in one track, Graham and a few others, more than 2/3 of the money spent on their campaigns or contributed to their campaigns, either to the campaign or independently, more than 2/3 of it is in independent money. So the Republicans are getting a much greater boost from that independent expenditure. In contrast, if you look at the Republican candidates who are sort of what we call the outsiders, and in particular this would be Trump, Fiorina, and Ben Carson, they're getting a very small fraction of their money. They're raising almost all of their own money. So the super PAC money, the independent expenditure money, is going to the Republicans, not the Democrats. And among Republicans, it's focusing down heavily on the establishment type candidates. To give you a sense of how slender a pillar that support is, that 68% is, for every Republican candidate except Bush, Clinton, and who's the third one? Cruz. Bush, no, it is Cruz. Cruz is the last one. Let me get my names here. I don't want to mistake this. There's three of them. Bush. Yeah, I don't have the third name, but there's three candidates who, for whom this isn't true. For everybody else, what I'm about to say is true, and that is that they got more than 50% of their support from less than 10 people. The super PAC money for everybody but three of the candidates on both sides of the aisle are getting more than half of their money from fewer than 10 people. And in an extreme case, if you look at Ted Cruz, for example, he's getting over 90% of his money from 3 people. Okay, so it's a very narrow slender of support that is putting that super PAC money into the campaigns of the establishment Republican candidates. But this is something we saw happening. We knew it was happening. It's a continuing, it's evolving. And so as a result, it's not really surprising. The other point to make about this money is how do they spend it? With all that money in the campaigns, how are they spending it? How is it affecting the candidates? And what we know from previous campaigns is that super PACs tend to spend their money on political ads. And so here's a graph done based on research done by Wesleyan University where they count the number of advertisements appearing in a campaign and who pays for them. So this isn't the dollars, this is the number of ads, and you can see that at this point in the campaign in 2007, 2011, and 2015, we can see how many ads were being paid for total, how many of those were produced by independent groups, how many were produced by candidates, and what you see is fairly modest growth in the total, about a 40% increase over 8 years, over 3 election cycles, but who's paying for it is dramatically different. Candidates are providing less than half the number of ads on television than they did back in 2017. This is not a percentage, this is a number. Candidates are putting out less than half the number of ads that they put out in 2017. Who's making up the difference? These independent groups. Back in 2017, which remember is before Citizens United, the amount of money is relatively modest. They're paying for, a few hundreds, a few thousand maybe, political ads. But by 2015, their number is up over 30,000, and they're picking up all of the weight. So what we see when independent expenditures come into a campaign, it affects the candidate's strategy. The candidates shift their money from advertising to other things. So for the candidates, it's a fungible issue. Yes, I can't account for the independent spending myself, but I know what it's going to, and so I can take that information and adjust my own spending into other areas. So that's a pattern that we've seen happening, and 2015 is continuing that. Okay, so if we go back to this page, we get the idea that there are certain things that have been happening over the last 3 or 4 campaign cycles, things we know about the Iowa caucuses, and they continue to be true. So looking forward, we can continue to expect Iowa to rely on the ground game. We can expect Iowa to winnow out the weak candidates. We can expect Iowa to continue to give bumps to the candidates who do well, particularly relative to expectations. And we can expect to see independent groups putting more and more money into political ads in Iowa. But what about Iowa that happened this year that is out of character with the past? What can we say about Iowa and really the whole process in general that has happened this time that really doesn't have precedent prior to this time? And looking ahead, I think the same thing we see about 2016 that is relatively unique is the extent to which the parties as organizations, that is, we think of party leaders, state party chairs, county party chairs, those kinds of folks, national party figures, the extent to which they've lost control over the nominating process. Okay, in the old days, which I'm going to call everything before 1968, the party had control of the nominating process. But today, they don't. And the thing that is driving that home, what I'm calling the impetus for us to realize that, is the rise of dissatisfaction among the rank and file of both Democrats and Republicans with the establishment in their party, what we think of as the sort of the establishment party figures. And so what I want to do is talk about two things. One is, where did this dissatisfaction come from? Why is 2016 such a high point of this kind of populist fervor, populist reaction to the establishment? And then secondly, talk about how are the parties coping with that? How are the parties dealing with that? How is the way they're dealing with it different than the way they've dealt with it in the past? So if we look at the Republican side of the equation in terms of where this is coming from, it's clearly coming from blue-collar supporters, social conservatives in the party who feel that they are being taken for granted, who feel that they're being ignored, who feel that they're being taken advantage of by the party establishment. This has long roots. It goes back to Ronald Reagan, and Reagan cultivating what at the time was called Reagan Democrats, and the Republican Party sort of expanding into the South in a way that was unprecedented. Coming out of the Civil War, it was unthinkable for a white voter in the South to be a member of the Republican Party. But by the time we get to 1980, we see this beginning to shift. And so Reagan cultivates the social conservatives. He cultivates the blue-collar Democrats who have been there, but they're not rewarded. They're not receiving the payoffs that they expect. And we see this happening in 80, 84, 88, and you begin to see candidates who run specifically representing these groups. And so Pat Robertson runs in 96, and Rick Santorum in the last election cycle, and Mike Huckabee before that, doing well, cultivating and representing these groups, but being rejected, being rebuffed by the party. And so this group of voters, over the last 30 years or so, are becoming increasingly unhappy with their party leaders. And so I think they go from being disappointed in their leaders, which would apply to Republican presidents in the 80s, to today, they're feeling betrayed by their party, that they're being taken for granted and then not getting what they were promised in terms of policy actions and movement by their party leaders. And so they're looking for someone outside the establishment. On the Democratic side, it's happening among progressives in the Democratic Party. And notice I said progressives, not liberals, right? Liberals is the way we would normally say this, but liberal in the last 20 years has taken on a very negative connotation. People don't want to be associated as being liberal, so they take on the label of progressives. And I think what you see in this election cycle is a sense of it's time to own up to our liberalism. It's time to act on this. It's time to stand up for what liberals stand up for. Now, the Democrats had an early bout with this if you go back to 72 and 76, but it grew out of the anti-war movement, the dissatisfaction with the war in Vietnam. And you saw George McGovern, who was clearly not a party establishment person, running for the Democrats, and then Jimmy Carter, who nobody had even heard of, running for the nomination in 76 and winning it. And that sort of got the party's attention, and the parties began to become more involved in this nominating process. But that tamped down. You don't really see this kind of angst from the progressives to the extent that you do among Republicans. However, the progressives were anticipating expectantly that Obama would be their progressive president. They feel disappointed. He hasn't delivered the goods. Not that it's his fault, dealing with the Republicans who control Congress for most of the time that he is in office. It'd be hard to get much of anything done. But Democrats don't yet feel betrayed. They just feel like Obama failed. We need somebody stronger. We need a pure kind of candidate. And so that's where the support for Bernie Sanders is coming from. But the point I want to make about this movement is that while it's building in support over the last 30 years or so, the parties have always faced these challenges, and they faced them in the past, and they've always been able to channel it. They've always been able to manage it. And what's different about 2016 is the parties aren't controlling the process the way they did in the past. They're not channeling the nominating process the way they have in the past. And so I want to turn to my second point. Why is that happening? How are the parties responding? Why are they so weak at dealing with candidates who are so far out of their own mainstream? Why are the candidates of the party organization doing so badly? Now, this idea that I'm going to talk about next, I have to caveat, say, this is kind of speculative. You're not necessarily going to see every political scientist agreeing with this idea. We'll have to wait and see how things develop over the next 2 or 3 election cycles. But what I want to tell you is a story of change in the attitude of Americans towards their government. And if you go back to our nation's founding and follow it all the way up to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, you see that we thought of ourselves as a republic. We're a democratic republic, but we're a republic. And so republic is a noun, and it's described by being democratic. But increasingly, especially with the change in the nominating processes I'm going to describe in a moment, voters are seeing us first and foremost as a democracy that manifests itself through Republican channels. So Republican channels, that simply means indirect choosing. We don't vote in Congress ourselves, we choose somebody to represent us. Okay? So it's indirect. A Republican form of government is an indirect form of government where the governors, if it's democratic, they're chosen by the people, but they act on the people's behalf. And so what we have to appreciate is that the founders strongly intended us to be a republic with a democratic nature. They wanted a democratic republic, not a republican democracy. They feared the possibility of majority tyranny. They feared the possibility of demagoguery. People who would come in and take advantage of the voters, move them in ways that weren't good for the country and therefore harm the country. They were especially concerned about this with the presidency. You notice the presidency is elected by the Electoral College. Well, where does the Electoral College come from? It comes from the states. And how do the states decide? It's up to them. States today say, well, we'll let our people vote and tell us how to allocate our electors, but that's not required. The states can allocate electors to the Electoral College however they want. The state legislature can say, we want to give this many to this candidate and that many to that candidate. We don't care how our voters vote. Today, because we're becoming more of a Republican democracy, states feel compelled to allocate their electors on the basis of the people's votes. But my point is that this really focused on the presidency. That's who they were worried. They didn't want the president to have a direct connection to the people. That could lead to what we would call a publicitary form of presidential leadership. The founders intended Congress to be the lead branch of government, and this would allow the president to overpower the Congress. So they were very concerned about hedging in the president and buffering the president from public connection. The thing the founders didn't do is anticipate the idea of nomination. If you look back at the early Electoral College votes, you'll see 5, 6 people getting electoral votes, because whoever the states want to vote for, that's who they vote for. And as we begin to coalesce into parties, the question comes up, well, who's going to be our party's representative? If we send 2 or 3 people out, their votes will be dissipated and somebody else will win. So we need to coalesce our views into one person to maximize our chances of winning. You see that happening in the 1800 election, 1804. Well, that requires a nominating process. That requires selecting a candidate. And since the 1830s, from the 1830s right through 1968, 130 years of our history, we had a party system that did the nominating for us. We, the people, were not involved in that nominating process in any appreciable degree. The metaphor I give my students to understand this, because it sounds so anti-democratic, is imagine you're here at the University of Iowa and you have a football team that you're going to put on the field on Saturday. Who gets to decide which players go on the field to play the game? The coaches. They watch the players, they know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, they know how they fit together. The coaches decide on the team to put on the field. We, the fans or the voters, then on game day, we go out and cheer for our side and hope they win. But we don't have a voice in choosing the players who play on the field. I'm left-handed. Maybe I would really wish we had a left-handed quarterback. The coaches don't care. They want to put the player out there who they think is going to do the best job. And we understood the process to be that way. It was democratic because we got to choose between the party's candidates. And that worked for us for 130 years. But 1968 was a watershed year in this. The anti-war movement really divided the Democratic Party. If you're old enough to remember the Chicago Convention, there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of controversy. Hubert Humphrey's candidacy was tainted because there was this movement of anti-war folks who had competed in primaries but didn't get any support at the convention. And so the Democratic Party said, we have to fix that. We have to make sure that the people are more represented in the nominating process. And so they created the McGovern Commission. The McGovern Commission put out reforms that said we have to have a more participatory process. We have to have a way for the voters to feel involved, to feel represented. It has to be representative of the people. And most of the states said the way to do this is to go to a primary, a direct primary, and not only a direct primary, but a primary where the delegates are bound by the vote of the voters. And so that begins in 72. By 1990s, about 35 to 40 actually, 35 to 40 of the states have direct primaries, and they tend to be the states with the bigger populations. So direct primaries are binding delegates to the convention where the nomination is going to be made, and what that does is take the parties out of the process. The parties as organizations used to be able to say, well, this is our guy and not that guy. If you go back to 1968, the establishment had their candidate. It was Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey did not run in a single primary in all of the 68 election cycle. Only Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy did. And yet, in the states that had primaries, there were about 12 of them, Humphrey won well over half of the delegates because while people voted in primaries, that didn't translate into delegates. And so the state parties said, we don't care about Kennedy, we don't care about McGovern, we want to give the nomination to our guy, Hubert Humphrey, and so they did. Well, that's the last time that happened. The party lost the ability to define themselves apart from the voters. The voters are now telling us what it means to be a Democrat. The voters are now telling us what it means to be a Republican. Donald Trump is a Republican because the voters say so. Bernie Sanders is a Democrat because the voters say so. I promise you, someone who comes to office as a socialist and doesn't identify as a Democrat, no matter how popular, is not somebody the Democratic establishment back in '68 is going to put into the party's seat as a nominee. But today, the party has lost that ability. And so we see the the government as a whole becoming more democracy rather than republic, and this is reflected in the nominating process, which is becoming more of a democracy-driven process rather than a Republican process. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say here. So how can we describe this new system? How can we describe this new system? It's no longer parties as coaches, candidates as players, and voters as fans. Today, candidates are more like entrepreneurs. They want to start up a business. It's a business of getting votes. They get people to give them capital. They get volunteers to give them labor, and they go into business. And nobody can tell them yes, nobody can tell them no. Most businesses fail, we know that. But somebody's going to succeed. The voters now are consumers, and they buy candidates by casting their votes. That puts the party out of the process. Now, the party for a long time tried to define itself in this dynamic as kind of a cartel building machine. That is, they wanted to control access to the marketplace. We want certain entrepreneurs to be able to build their machines and try to close others out. But over time, it became increasingly clear that the parties lacked that ability, lacked that cartel controlling ability. And so more and more people who don't belong to the Democratic, don't belong to the Republican Party, don't have ties and roots there, nonetheless are coming into the process seeking the nomination. So the parties are losing control of that process. So, as parties lose that control, the role in the nominating process changes. And so I want to suggest that before the reforms of '72, we can think of the parties as arbiters. And an arbiter is someone who makes a decision when there's conflict. You take something to arbitration, I want this, you want that, we let the arbiter decide, and that was the party's role. and they would take contending candidates and they would make their decision. 1956, Estes Kefauver, a name that has gone down and people don't remember anymore, but he was a rising star. He was an anti-corruption kind of guy. Democratic Party said, we don't want you. And he was consigned to competing in primaries, gets very few delegates, and the party awards the nomination to Adlai Stevenson. Same thing, as I said, happened in '68. The anti-war movement, we don't want you. You're consigned to the primaries. We want Hubert Humphrey. And so the party is the arbiter. After 1968, after the McGovern reforms, the party is taken out of that role, but it continues to be an advocate. It continues to play a game pushing for certain candidates. It tries to define its identity by its rules, by the way it endorses candidates, and it's contending with others who are striving to make the party what they want it to be. And so the party is trying to influence voter choices. So how do they do that? They do it with rule changes. The Democrats adopt in the 1980s the threshold rule. If you don't have 15% of the vote, you get no delegates. Well, what are they doing? They're trying to squeeze out the outsider candidates. They establish a rule called superdelegates, which means somebody who is from the party or an elected official gets to go to the convention and vote without being connected to a candidate. And that's another way to try to funnel party influence into the nominating process. They do it through endorsements. This is an informal coordination process where party leaders coordinate their endorsements to say, this is our guy, let's consolidate behind him. And very importantly, they had a dominant role to play in the campaign finance system. Today, the campaign finance system that ran from '72 to 2000 doesn't exist anymore. Under the campaign finance system in those years, there was a voluntary funding mechanism in place, which said if you take if you're willing to limit the amount of money you spend, we will give you federal dollars to augment your campaign. And if you win your party's nomination, we will give you all the money that you need to run your campaign. But you have to agree to only spend the amount of money that we say is appropriate for you. And because fundraising in those days was very difficult, very time consuming, candidates flocked to that system. And so candidates in the 70s and 80s and 90s had spending limits that they willingly accepted. Now, in that system, there really weren't the independent expenditures that we see today. Who was the source of funding that augmented this? It was the parties. The parties in 1979 pushed through a revision of the campaign finance laws that took spending limits off of donations to parties. And so you could only give $1,000 to a candidate, you could give $1 million to a party. Now, you're only supposed to spend the money on civic-minded party-building activities, but gradually the candidates figured out how to get the parties to spend their money in ways that helped them win the election. So in the 1990s, we see this kind of spending, we called it soft money back then. This soft money balloons as a proportion of the spending. So much so that in 2002, we pass a law to cap that. And John McCain and Feingold pushed through a campaign finance reform that puts a cap on the amount of money you can give parties again. But so in this period, parties were very important because they could shape the flow of money to candidates. Today, and this is the most speculative part of what I'm suggesting, is the party has been reduced to playing the role of arena. They've been reduced to playing the role of arena. Now, what do I mean by that? The parties, as organizations, have shifted their focus from who's the best candidate, what does the party stand for, do we think we should have more taxes or less taxes, do we want to put more into national security or less, do we want to, what do we want to do as a policy position? And parties have shifted to focusing on the process. We set up the rules by which the contenders and the factions and the candidates compete. Okay? So we're going to define the arena in which this takes place, but we're not going to actively step in and advocate for one candidate or another. Now, if your focus shifts from substance to process, your legitimacy, your authority in the process is grounded in and based on the perception that you're playing the game fair, that you're playing fairly. In a sense, you're going to be an umpire. You no longer are advocate. You're calling the balls and strikes, and you'd better be fair to everybody. I had party leaders come to my class just this last winter term. And it was fascinating, it was almost stunning, the extent to which they said, oh yes, we are very neutral. We give everybody access to our websites. We help everybody line up rooms. We wouldn't think of endorsing a candidate, okay? And that's the party people. Now, that doesn't mean all elected officials are that way. Clearly, Representative King from Northwest Iowa endorsed Cruz, and that was important. But if you remember the mini controversy that surrounded Governor Branstad saying anybody but Cruz, you know, why is he doing that? Why is he stepping into the process? Branstad was trying to become an advocate, in this case a negative advocate, but an advocate, and the pushback was, no, 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 you're supposed to be the umpire. You're supposed to be neutral. You shouldn't be doing that. And so there was some controversy about that. So the bottom line is if the party's an arena, all it does is set up the playing field. If we are moving into this party as arena, how are the parties going to manage the caucus process? And with that, I'll finish and take any questions. Yes?
So Kasich skipped Iowa and went right to New Hampshire. Does that play into a little bit of your Iowas and is relevant? Because here he
Well, he did that.
second.
Yeah, he did that for strategic reasons. He's not strong in Iowa. He didn't. He knew, you know, another common wisdom about Iowa, New Hampshire is if you don't finish in the top 3 at one of them, you can't win. Nobody's won without finishing in the top 3 in one of them. He knew he had no chance of finishing in the top 3 in Iowa, so he ditches Iowa to put all of his energy into New Hampshire. So he makes more visits, spend more days, more time in New Hampshire. That's just a strategic allocation of resources thing. If he'd have had more strength in Iowa than New Hampshire, he would have done the other way. In 2008, John McCain stays out of Iowa because he's opposed to the ethanol subsidy. He finishes 4th or 5th. But he goes on to do well in New Hampshire and later and wins the nomination. So no, I don't think we've seen anybody stay away from Iowa yet because they don't trust the party to be fair. I don't think we've seen that yet, but we could. That's my question. In 2020, are candidates going to start saying, well, I'm not going there. It's like the straw poll and I don't want to do that. And if that happens, if somebody stays away because the process isn't fair, then Iowa's status as first in the nation with all this media attention is at risk. Yeah?
How different is the way the Republicans conduct the caucus from a national primary? I mean, it's not, you know, just
Yeah, I promise you, if the Democrats did it the way the Republicans did, New Hampshire would say, you're a primary, you just don't let people vote from 8 to 7 in the night, you just make them vote in a certain part of time. The Republicans clearly have their toe over the line. It's the Democrats that are keeping New Hampshire at bay. If the Democrats adopt the Republican rules, New Hampshire will say this deal is off and we're going to go ahead of you.
And do you see any way for the Democrats to make modifications that would still keep the aura of caucus without having all that messy mess that goes on?
Yeah. I had the not the honor, but the enlightening experience of talking with a guy named Richard, I think his last name's Silver, who was in Iowa in the 1970s. And he's actually sort of considered the midwife of the Iowa caucuses, going from the old system in the 60s to the new system in the 70s. And so he created this delegate equivalent, or he's one of the guys that had a hand in creating the delegate equivalent process. And he's adamant that the Democrats cannot go away from delegate equivalents. If they do, New Hampshire will lower the boom and we'll be in a fight with them about who gets to go first, and we'll start having caucuses at Halloween, you know, who knows. Yeah, I don't see a way forward. That's why I think it's a dilemma. If there was an easy fix, I'd propose it, but I don't see the easy fix. The parties need to get creative, and I'm not sure what that is.
Gary, how much of the potential irrelevance is simply the fact that we're not representative of the country?
Yeah, okay, but that question, yeah.
Produce a candidate
Yeah, so how important is it that Iowa isn't demographically or occupationally representative of the nation? If it were just Iowa and New Hampshire, that would be more resonant. And the parties have stepped in to address that by adding South Carolina and Nevada to this process before the rest of the states get to go. So you have 2 states, yes, where white voters, rural voters tend to have more of a voice. And then you have a primary in the South where African Americans are more prominent, and you have an event, a caucus in Nevada where Latino candidates or Latino voters are more prevalent. And so the parties, by creating a package of events, feel like they've addressed this question. So the big question now is, can Bernie Sanders extend his success among white voters to African American or Latino voters? And so it's a package deal. It's not just one standing by itself. So I don't think that's the problem. That's been an issue that people have raised forever, and it's never pushed for a change in the process. And there's a lot of reasons for that that I don't want to go into in terms of defending Iowa. But that's been something the parties have been able to deal with for a long time. I don't see that being the source of change. I see the source of dissatisfaction with not being able to trust the result to be accurate. Other questions? Yeah.
I saw this morning on one station that Hillary Clinton has more delegates now than Bernie Sanders, and I assume that's because of the superdelegates. And so the party is controlling, at least so
Okay.
far,
Okay.
the march toward the nomination.
So without having the knowledge that you have, I can't speak to that decisively. But what we saw in 2008 was the toothlessness of the superdelegate. In 2008, the Clinton campaign, now pushing against Obama, tried to do this, tried to invoke, hey, superdelegates, get behind me. Obama's just got a couple of 100-delegate lead. You can put me in the front. And what the superdelegates said was, hey, I report to those people. They elect me. You think I'm going to go back to my state and say, you guys were wrong, you made a bad decision, you should have voted for this other candidate, I'm going to prove it, I'm going to stick my thumb in your eye by saying I'm going to vote for the other candidate? Nobody whose life depends on being elected is going to do that. So that fell flat. So in 1984, Walter Mondale did that. He locked up the superdelegates early, and that helped him weather the challenge from Gary Hart. But subsequently, superdelegates have sort of stayed back, haven't declared, just like the endorsements. Endorsements are nowhere near where they've been in past elections. That people are holding back. They don't want to back a loser, okay? And so I don't think that's, and once your state's voted, that's how that locks the superdelegate down. So I just don't think that's a viable strategy. You can try it, but I don't think it will overcome the primary-driven outcomes. Anything else?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's not really caucus per
Sure.
se, but maybe you'll speculate on it. On caucus night, Hillary Clinton declared herself the winner, and all the stations that I looked at seemed to be surprised by that and wondered where she got that, the notion to do that.
Well, she did it from
So
the
close.
Democratic website, and at some point a sufficient proportion. I mean, a candidate can declare whatever they want.
Well, right.
What matters is when did the party declare?
Or the interpretation.
Yeah, she's trying to spin it, right? Yeah,
Right.
so you're going to go to bed at 11 o'clock, and if the party hasn't declared, I miss my chance to stamp something on the election in your mind. And so that's what you do. Is if it's close and you think you're going to win, go ahead. Who cares if tomorrow morning you didn't? I don't think it hurt Romney in the least to be told, oh, actually you lost and Santorum won. And see, what I'm saying is, when it's that close, a caucus can really only say, well, it's really close. That's all a caucus can do. It can't say decisively, you're the winner, you're the loser. Even in an election, you have a hard time when it gets that close. Think back to Florida in 2000. So to ask a caucus to be precise in that context is unreasonable. And since it's unreasonable, it can't be fixed, I don't think. And that's where the undermining of the authoritativeness of the caucus has come from. As long as one candidate's way out in front, it's not a problem. It's when a candidate two candidates are close to each other, that the caucuses are going to break down and people aren't going to trust the results. The losers will always challenge the process. That challenges legitimacy, and therefore the media is going to say, well, let's not pay attention. And that will feed back into the next election cycle, just as we saw. That's why the Iowa straw poll went away. It was so unreliable as a predictor. Michelle Bachmann won the straw poll. She was gone before the caucuses even happened. So people said, well, it doesn't really matter.
It is interesting, in these early states, you can finish second or third and you watch the after-election celebration, you can't tell the second or third place from the winner.
Right.
Kasich followed Trump last night and you thought Kasich won from.
Right. Well, that's okay. So how do you determine who the winner is? And that's driven largely by media expectations. The media drives that, and that's outside the control of the caucus procedure, right? So Kasich surprises, that makes him a winner. Rubio surprises, that makes him a winner. If you go back to 1984, do you know what percentage of the vote Gary Hart got in Iowa? It was like 17%. Okay, Mondale got more than half. And yet the winner was Gary Hart because he was expected to end up in single digits. So coming out of Iowa, he was the one with momentum. So that's just a media-driven process, and you can like it or dislike it, but it really has nothing to do with the Iowa caucuses.
Harry, thank you so
Thank you.
very much. Thank you all for your questions. The next Lunch and Learn will be on March 21st, Monday. And Sarah Gardial, who is the Dean of our College of Business, will be speaking to us. And her title is Lean In, Lean On, and Lean Together. And you'll just all have to come to find out what that's all about. Thank you so much.